The night was cold and silent as Albus Dumbledore stood outside the Burrow, his deep blue robes swaying gently in the breeze. The twinkling lights from the house illuminated his face as he peered down at the small bundle in his arms. Inside the soft, woolen blankets was a baby, barely over a year old, sleeping soundly despite the tragic fate that had just befallen him. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, had lost his parents mere hours ago. Lily and James Potter were gone, their lives taken by Voldemort's hand, and now this innocent child was left orphaned. Dumbledore had debated where to place him. Petunia Dursley was his blood relative, but he had long feared how she would treat a wizard child. He could not let Lily's son suffer through a loveless childhood. He had made his choice. The Burrow's door creaked open, and Molly Weasley appeared, wearing a heavy dressing gown over her nightclothes. Her expression was one of confusion and concern, but the moment she saw the baby in Dumbledore's arms, her face softened. "Molly," Dumbledore greeted, his voice kind yet heavy with the weight of the night's events. "I must ask something of you." Molly stepped forward, gazing down at the child. "Is that—" She didn't need to finish her sentence. The lightning-shaped scar on his forehead confirmed everything. "Yes," Dumbledore nodded. "Harry Potter." Arthur Weasley appeared behind his wife, rubbing his eyes from sleep. "Dumbledore, what's going on?" Molly turned to her husband, eyes brimming with emotion. "He's asking us to take him in, Arthur." Arthur's face filled with surprise, but he quickly glanced at the child, then at Dumbledore, and finally back at his wife. He knew Molly's heart. He knew that the answer was already yes. And truly, he didn't need convincing. The Weasleys had always longed for a big, loving family, and although they already had young Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, and Ron, there was always room for one more. Dumbledore's gaze lingered on them. "Harry will need protection, love, and guidance. He will be famous before he can even understand what that means. And I fear that growing up in the Muggle world may not be the safest option. I trust you, Molly. Arthur, will you raise him as one of your own?" Molly's answer was immediate. "Of course. He'll be our son." Arthur nodded firmly. "We'll give him a home." A smile of relief crossed Dumbledore's face as he gently placed the sleeping boy into Molly's arms. The warmth of her embrace stirred the baby slightly, and for the first time that night, Harry opened his bright green eyes. He blinked up at Molly, and for a moment, a flash of sadness crossed his tiny features. Perhaps, even at his young age, he could feel that something was missing. But then, as Molly held him closer, whispering soothing words, he nestled into her warmth. He was safe. He was home. Years passed, and Harry Weasley, as he had come to be known, grew up surrounded by warmth, laughter, and chaos. Unlike the childhood he would have had at the Dursleys, he never felt unwanted. He was never locked in a cupboard, never treated as a burden. Instead, he was a brother, a son. From a young age, he was inseparable from Ron. They did everything together, getting into trouble, playing outside, and even sneaking bites of Molly's cooking when she wasn't looking. Fred and George took great joy in using him as a test subject for their pranks, while Percy scolded them both. Charlie and Bill, though older, treated him with the same kindness and fondness they showed their younger siblings. For Harry, there was never a question of belonging. He was a Weasley in every way that mattered. But there was something that set him apart. Magic came to him naturally, almost too naturally. While Ron struggled to levitate a feather, Harry could do it on his first try. When Fred and George tried to prank him, his accidental magic always seemed to protect him in ways that left even the twins baffled. Molly and Arthur noticed, of course. They knew Harry had a great destiny ahead, but they never treated him differently. They never let the whispers of his past define him. Yet, despite all the love, a shadow always lingered over Harry's heart. A curiosity. Why did he have a scar? Why did strangers sometimes look at him as if they recognized him? Why did he have dreams of a woman screaming his name? Molly always assured him that he was safe, that they loved him. And he believed her. But deep down, something inside him yearned for answers. And soon enough, they would come. On Harry's 11th birthday, the Weasleys celebrated as they always did, with an over-the-top breakfast, laughter, and presents. But there was one gift that stood out among the rest. An envelope. Thick parchment. A wax seal bearing the crest of Hogwarts. Harry and Ron both received their letters that morning, and the house erupted into chaos. Fred and George recounted every crazy thing they could about Hogwarts. Peeves the poltergeist, the moving staircases, the forbidden forest. Percy proudly talked about his status as a prefect, while Ginny, who was a year too young, pouted about having to wait. Molly bustled around, already making plans for their school shopping trip. But as Harry held the letter in his hands, excitement bubbling in his chest, he felt something else too. A sense of fate, a feeling that, when he stepped into Hogwarts, he might finally understand why the world looked at him so strangely. Why he wasn't just Harry Weasley, but Harry Potter, the boy who lived. The cobbled streets of Diagon Alley bustled with life as the Weasley family stepped through the brick archway behind the leaky cauldron. Harry's eyes widened in awe. This was magic, real, undeniable magic, right in front of him. Witches and wizards in colorful robes hurried past. Owls hooted from their cages in the pet shop window, and the scent of freshly baked goods from a nearby cart filled the air. Ron was just as excited, even though he'd seen it all before. "Blimey, Harry, look at that broomstick." He pointed toward the window display of quality Quidditch supplies, where a sleek, golden-handled broom rested on a velvet cushion. Fred and George smirked. "Sorry, mate, that's the Nimbus 2000. No way first years are getting one of those." "Not unless you make the Quidditch team," George added, winking at Harry. Harry barely heard them. He was too busy soaking everything in. Unlike Ron, he hadn't grown up hearing tales of Gringotts goblins or joke shops run by prankster wizards. He had spent his childhood in the warm, busy chaos of the Burrow, but he had never seen this side of the wizarding world. Molly led the group toward Gringotts, herding them like a mother hen. "Come along now, no dawdling. We've got a lot to get done." Arthur, always fascinated by the goblins, took every chance to study the creatures as they approached the grand marble doors of the bank. As they entered, Molly pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket, carefully counting out a few galleons and sickles. The Weasleys were never wealthy, and every purchase had to be planned. Harry, unsure of what to do, stepped forward hesitantly. Do I have any money?" Molly and Arthur exchanged glances. They had never taken Harry to Gringotts before, never spoken of his inheritance. They had wanted him to grow up as a Weasley, not as the orphaned hero of the wizarding world. But now, as they stood in front of a goblin teller, there was no avoiding it. Molly cleared her throat. "You do, dear. But we never wanted you to worry about that. Dumbledore made arrangements for your parents' vault to be protected until you needed it." Harry blinked in surprise. He had money. His parents had left him something? The idea sent a strange pang through his chest. He had never known them, never even seen a picture of them. But this was something they had left behind for him. Arthur spoke with the goblin, who led Harry deeper into the bank, down into the twisting underground tunnels where the carts raced through the passages. The ride was exhilarating, though Harry barely paid attention. His thoughts were swirling too fast. When they stopped in front of Vault 687, the goblin pressed a long, crooked key into the lock, and the heavy door swung open. Gold. Stacks of it. More money than Harry had ever seen in his life. His breath hitched. Molly placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your parents wanted you to be taken care of. You don't have to spend it all, dear. Just enough for your school things." Harry swallowed hard. This was real. His past was real. He wasn't just Harry Weasley, the boy who wrestled with Ron over the last piece of toast or got pranked by Fred and George. He was Harry Potter, son of James and Lily, with a history that stretched beyond the warmth of the Burrow. They took only what they needed, and soon they were back outside in the sunlit streets of Diagon Alley. The rest of the shopping trip passed in a blur. Ron groaned about having to use Percy's old wand, Fred and George caused chaos in Gamble and Japes, and Molly nearly had a heart attack when Ginny tried to smuggle a pygmy puff into her robes. But one moment stood out. Ollivander's. The dusty little shop was dimly lit, the scent of aged wood and parchment filling the air. The old wand maker himself appeared from the shadows, his pale eyes scanning Harry with keen interest. "Ah, Mr. Potter. I was wondering when I'd be seeing you." Harry hesitated. "It's Weasley, actually. Harry Weasley." Ollivander's gaze didn't waver. "Indeed. But names do not change destinies." Harry didn't know what to say to that. Instead, he watched as Ollivander measured his arm, then began pulling wands from the shelves, handing them to him one by one. Nothing felt right. Some sparked, some hissed. One nearly set Ron's sleeve on fire. Ollivander only seemed mildly amused. Then finally he pulled out a wand in a long, simple box. Holly and phoenix feather. 11 inches. Supple. The moment Harry's fingers wrapped around it, warmth spread through his palm, a golden glow illuminating the tip. Ollivander's face was unreadable. Curious, very curious. Harry shifted. What's curious? The wand maker studied him carefully. That wand shares a core with another. One that gave you that scar. The words sent a cold shiver down Harry's spine. Molly, sensing his unease, stepped forward. Come along, dear. We've got everything now. Harry nodded slowly, tucking the wand safely into its box. But as he followed the Weasleys out of the shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in his life, he wondered if his past wasn't just something to ignore. Maybe it was something he needed to understand. The days leading up to September 1st were filled with excitement and nervous energy at the Burrow. The house was in chaos as Molly rushed to pack trunks, check book lists, and ensure that everyone had their robes and wands accounted for. Fred and George were no help at all, sneaking in dung bombs and pretending to help by levitating objects that inevitably crashed to the floor. Harry had never seen anything like it. Growing up in the Burrow had always felt like home. But now, with the realization that he was about to step into the wizarding world properly, everything felt different. He lay awake at night in the room he shared with Ron, staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzing with questions. What if he wasn't as good as the others? What if the teachers expected him to know things he didn't? Would people treat him differently when they realized he was Harry Potter? The morning of their departure was hectic. Molly was ushering them out the door before the sun had fully risen, stuffing last-minute sandwiches into their hands while Arthur struggled to find his glasses. Ginny looked ready to cry, already missing her brothers before they had even left. At King's Cross Station, they maneuvered their way through the crowded Muggle platforms until they reached the seemingly solid barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Molly turned to Harry with a reassuring smile. Now, dear, it's very simple. You just walk straight at the barrier, nice and steady. Best to take it at a bit of a run if you're nervous. Harry watched as Percy, Fred, and George disappeared through the wall with practiced ease. Ron nudged him. Go on, I'll be right behind you. Harry took a deep breath, tightened his grip on his trolley, and pushed forward. He expected to hit solid brick, but instead he passed effortlessly onto the other side, where a magnificent red steam engine stood waiting. The sign overhead read, Hogwarts Express. A thrill ran through him. He was really going. Molly fussed over them one last time before Fred and George hopped onto the train, Percy already finding a seat in the prefect's compartment. Ron and Harry dragged their trunks aboard, searching for an empty compartment. They found one near the back, tossing their bags onto the overhead racks before slumping into the seats with relief. The train let out a loud whistle, the platform slowly sliding away as the wheels began to turn. This is it, Ron said, grinning. We're finally on our way to Hogwarts. Harry grinned back, the nerves in his stomach replaced by excitement. He had dreamed of this moment for as long as he could remember. The adventure was beginning. Not long into the journey, the door to their compartment slid open. A bushy-haired girl with a bossy expression peered in. Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost his. Ron groaned. Blimey, we just sat down. Harry, always eager to help, shook his head. Sorry, we haven't seen one. The girl looked them over, her gaze landing on Ron's wand. You're doing magic? Let's see then. Ron cleared his throat, lifting his wand dramatically. Sunshine Daisy's buttermellow, turn this stupid, fat rat yellow. He flicked his wand at Scabbers, who lay curled up on his lap, snoring. Nothing happened. The girl crossed her arms. Are you sure that's a real spell? It doesn't sound very effective. Ron flushed. Yeah. Well, let's see you do better. She smirked and pulled out her wand. I've already learned a few. Oculus Reparo. She pointed at Harry's glasses, which had been slightly bent from all the shuffling at the station. Instantly, the frames mended themselves. Harry blinked. Whoa, that was brilliant. She looked pleased. I read all about it in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. I'm Hermione Granger, by the way. And you are? Ron Weasley. Harry Weasley, Harry added without thinking. Hermione frowned. Weasley? But, She looked at him more closely, her eyes widening. "You're Harry Potter." Ron's head snapped toward him. "Oh, come off it, Hermione. Everyone knows he's Harry Weasley." She shook her head. "No, I mean he is Harry Potter. The scar, the glasses. I read about him in Hogwarts, a history." Harry's stomach twisted. He hadn't really thought about it much since Ollivander's, but here it was again. That reminder that he wasn't just Harry Weasley. He was Harry Potter. Ron scowled. "He's my brother. So what if he's got a famous name?" Hermione hesitated. "I suppose. It's just odd. The books said he was raised by Muggles, but—" Harry cut in quickly, forcing a smile. "I was raised by the Weasleys. Best family in the world." Ron beamed, and for a moment Harry felt warm inside. He wasn't lying. No matter what his past was, this was his real family. The train ride continued, and soon enough, they were changing into their Hogwarts robes. As the sky darkened outside, the train slowed, and an excited buzz filled the air. They were finally here. Stepping off the train, Harry's breath caught as he took in the towering silhouette of Hogwarts Castle against the night sky. Lanterns flickered along the path, and a booming voice called out, "Fur's years! Fur's years over here." A giant of a man stood near the lake, waving them forward. Ron whispered, "That's Hagrid. Mum and Dad talk about him sometimes." Harry barely heard him. His heart pounded as he followed the other first years toward the boats that would carry them across the lake. The reflection of Hogwarts shimmered in the water, and for the first time in his life, Harry truly understood. He was part of something bigger. The Weasleys had given him a home, but Hogwarts was about to give him a future. The boats glided across the black lake, the towering silhouette of Hogwarts casting long shadows against the water. Harry shivered, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cool night air or the overwhelming anticipation building inside him. Ron sat beside him, his face pale in the moonlight. "This is it," Ron muttered, gripping the edge of the boat. "The sorting." Harry swallowed. He had heard stories about the sorting. Some said you had to duel a troll. Others claimed there was a test where you had to perform magic in front of the teachers. The idea of standing in front of the entire school and failing miserably made his stomach twist. Hagrid's booming voice broke through his thoughts. "All right, out of the boats, follow me." They clambered onto the rocky shore, staring up at the castle's massive entrance. The doors creaked open, and a stern-looking woman in emerald robes stood before them. Her sharp gaze swept over the group. "I am Professor McGonagall. In a few moments, you will enter the Great Hall and be sorted into your houses. Your house will be your family at Hogwarts. You will earn points for good behavior and lose them for rule breaking. At the end of the year, the house with the most points wins the House Cup." Harry felt Ron tense beside him. "Fred and George always lose loads of points for Gryffindor," he whispered. McGonagall continued, "The sorting ceremony will begin shortly. Follow me." They were led through the grand doors into the Great Hall, and Harry's breath caught. Floating candles illuminated the vast space, their flames flickering high above 4 long tables filled with students. The ceiling looked exactly like the night sky, stars twinkling above them. "It's bewitched to look like the sky outside," Hermione whispered. "I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." Harry barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on the front of the hall, where a frayed, ancient hat sat on a stool. Then, to his astonishment, it began to sing. The hat's song told the story of the 4 Hogwarts founders and the qualities they valued in their students. Courage for Gryffindor, loyalty for Hufflepuff, wisdom for Ravenclaw, and ambition for Slytherin. When the song ended, McGonagall stepped forward. "When I call your name, come forward, sit on the stool, and place the hat on your head." Names were called, and one by one, students approached the stool. The hat would consider for a moment before shouting the name of their house. Some were sorted instantly, others took a while. Hermione Granger practically ran to the stool, and the hat debated before finally declaring, "Gryffindor." Ron groaned. "I hope I get Gryffindor. Imagine if I end up in Slytherin." Harry wasn't sure what to hope for. Then his name was called. Harry Weasley. Whispers broke out among the students. The hat hadn't said Potter, but some still recognized him. Harry swallowed hard and walked toward the stool, his hands clammy. He sat down, and the hat was placed over his head. It slipped down past his ears, and then a voice spoke inside his mind. "Ah, interesting. Very interesting. A Potter raised as a Weasley, I see. You've got courage, that's for sure. A sharp mind, too. But there's something else, something hidden deep within you. Great potential. Harry held his breath. Not Slytherin, he thought desperately. The hat chuckled. Not Slytherin? Are you sure? You could do well there, you know. No, Harry insisted. I want to be with my family. Ah, loyalty. Strong indeed. The hat was silent for a moment, then. Better be. Gryffindor. Applause erupted from the Gryffindor table as Harry pulled off the hat, his heart pounding. He made his way over, sliding into a seat beside Hermione. Across the table, Percy was clapping proudly. Fred and George cheered. Ron was called next, and the hat barely touched his head before it shouted, Gryffindor. He nearly tripped over himself in his excitement as he ran to join Harry. Brilliant. We're in the same house. The sorting continued, and finally, McGonagall took the stool and hat away. Dumbledore rose, beaming at the students. Welcome. Before we begin our feast, let me say just a few words. Nitwit. Blubber. Oddment. Tweak. Thank you. The hall burst into laughter, and then, as if by magic, which it was, the golden plates in front of them filled with food. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, buttered peas, and more than Harry had ever seen in his life. Ron immediately started piling food onto his plate. This is the best night ever. Harry grinned, feeling warm and happy. This was where he belonged. He wasn't Harry Potter, the boy who lived. He was Harry Weasley, Gryffindor, brother and friend. And for the first time, he truly felt at home. The Gryffindor common room was buzzing with energy as the newly sorted first years were led inside. The fire crackled warmly in the massive stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. The red and gold decor, the plush armchairs, and the excited chatter made Harry feel like he had truly stepped into a new life. Blimey, can you believe it? Ron said, dropping onto a couch beside Harry. We're officially Gryffindors, just like Bill, Charlie, and the twins. Percy, who had been leading the first years, clapped his hands. As a prefect, let me remind you all that curfew is at 9, and first years are not allowed in the Forbidden Forest. The staircases move, so be careful not to get lost. He adjusted his glasses. And don't forget, tomorrow your classes start, so get some rest. Fred and George appeared out of nowhere, grinning mischievously. Ignore him, said Fred. The real fun at Hogwarts is finding out how many rules you can bend without getting caught. Exactly, added George. Stick with us, little brother, and we'll show you the ropes. Ron groaned. Mum will kill me if I get in trouble. Harry chuckled, but he was already feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The sorting, the feast, the newness of it all. It was a lot to take in. He glanced around, watching the other first years find their way to their dormitories. Neville Longbottom, the round-faced boy who had lost his toad earlier, was already struggling with his trunk. Hermione, on the other hand, was inspecting the bookshelves in the corner, as if she had just found a treasure trove. Yawning, Harry stretched. We should probably head up too. The first-year boys' dormitory was at the top of a winding staircase. Inside, 5 four-poster beds were arranged in a circle, each with deep red curtains. Harry found his trunk at the foot of his bed, Hedwig already settled in her cage near the window. Ron flopped onto his bed with a satisfied sigh. This is amazing. We get to live in a castle, eat whatever we want, and do magic all day. Seamus Finnegan, a sandy-haired boy with an Irish accent, was already unpacking. My mum's a witch, but my dad's a muggle. He was shocked when she told him. Dean Thomas, a tall boy with a West Ham football poster in his trunk, grinned. I grew up in London. Never thought I'd actually be doing magic. Neville, still fumbling with his belongings, looked nervous. I just hope I don't mess anything up. My gran always said I wasn't very magical. Harry listened to them, realizing just how different everyone's backgrounds were. He had grown up as a Weasley, surrounded by magic, but still had so much to learn. He had spent his childhood watching Ron and his brothers practice spells, but now, finally, he'd be learning them himself. As the night stretched on, their conversation drifted off. One by one, the boys fell asleep. Harry lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The soft rustling of curtains and the distant hoot of Hedwig were the only sounds. He couldn't believe he was here. Hogwarts. Magic. A new future. But in the back of his mind, he wondered, What if the Sorting Hat had chosen differently? What if he wasn't a Weasley? Would things still feel this, right? For now, he didn't have an answer. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. He had a family. He had a home. And tomorrow, his journey as a real wizard would begin. Morning at Hogwarts was a whirlwind of noise and excitement. The Gryffindor first years scrambled to get ready, some still half asleep as they fumbled with their robes. Ron groaned when Percy knocked on their door, reminding them not to be late for breakfast. Harry stretched, rubbing his eyes. He had slept better than he ever had at Privet Drive. No cupboard, no chores, just a warm bed and the quiet hum of the castle around him. Down in the great hall, the long tables were already piled high with breakfast: toast, eggs, bacon, porridge, and pumpkin juice. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Harry and Ron slid into seats beside Hermione and Neville. "You have your schedules yet?" Hermione asked eagerly. "I got mine from McGonagall this morning. First class is Transfiguration." Ron groaned again. "Already? I was hoping we'd get a week off or something." Fred, sitting across from them, laughed. "A week off? Hogwarts doesn't do easy, little brother." George nodded. "Especially not with McGonagall. She's brilliant, but she won't go easy on you." Harry took a bite of toast, feeling the excitement bubble in his chest. He was going to learn real magic today. No more watching from the sidelines. This time, he'd actually be casting spells. The great hall buzzed with students discussing their first lessons, but it was hard not to notice the owls swooping overhead. The morning post had arrived. Letters and packages rained down as owls dropped mail onto plates and into waiting hands. A small brown owl suddenly landed right in front of Ron, skidding across the table and knocking over a goblet of pumpkin juice. "Errol!" Ron groaned, grabbing the old, exhausted owl before it keeled over. "You really shouldn't be flying anymore." Fred and George burst out laughing as Ron carefully unrolled the letter attached to Errol's leg. His face turned red as he read it. "It's from Mum," he muttered. "She says she's proud of me and Harry for getting into Gryffindor, but," he winced, "she's also reminding me to behave and not to listen to Fred and George." "Oi," George said, pretending to be offended. "Why do we always get blamed?" "You do cause trouble," Hermione pointed out. "That's beside the point," Fred said, grinning. Harry laughed, but before he could take another bite, Percy stood up from the prefect's table. "First years, follow me to class." The excitement returned as they grabbed their bags and hurried after him, weaving through the castle's many staircases. Harry barely had time to take in the moving portraits before they arrived at their first classroom. McGonagall was waiting for them, her sharp eyes scanning the students as they took their seats. "Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts," she said crisply. "Anyone caught messing around in my class will leave immediately." She tapped the desk with her wand, and in an instant, it transformed into a sleek black cat with piercing green eyes. The class gasped. "This is what you will learn if you work hard," she continued, her voice cool and measured. With another tap, the cat morphed back into a desk. "Now, let's see if you can turn a matchstick into a needle." Harry exchanged a look with Ron, who muttered, "We're doomed." As expected, Hermione had already started waving her wand precisely, while most of the class struggled. Harry focused, trying to get it right. He wasn't bad. His matchstick seemed to turn silver, though it was still vaguely matchstick-shaped. Ron's, however, remained completely unchanged. "Ugh," Ron groaned. "This is impossible." Neville's matchstick had somehow caught fire, and Seamus Finnegan had managed to make his explode. McGonagall sighed but didn't seem surprised. After a long and somewhat frustrating lesson, they finally moved on to charms, where Professor Flitwick squeaked with excitement upon calling Harry's name. "You're Weasley's newest addition." A pleasure," he said, nearly toppling off his stack of books. They spent the lesson practicing the correct way to swish and flick their wands. Hermione was already mastering the movement, while Ron nearly whacked Harry in the face. By the time lunch rolled around, Harry's brain felt like it might explode. "This is mental," Ron groaned, collapsing onto a bench at the Gryffindor table. "I thought magic would be easy. This is worse than Mum making me degnome the garden." "But it's brilliant," Harry said, still buzzing with excitement. "We're actually doing magic." Hermione, looking pleased with herself, set down her book. It's just practice. We'll get better. Ron didn't look convinced. Harry barely had time to enjoy his meal before a voice called from behind them. Well, well, if it isn't the Weasley charity case and his little fan club. Draco Malfoy stood there, flanked by Crabbe and Goyle. His sneer was unmistakable. Harry tensed. He had barely spoken to Malfoy since the train, but he could already tell he was trouble. Shove off, Malfoy, Ron muttered, reaching for his pumpkin juice. Draco smirked. I was just wondering how long it would take before you lot got kicked out of Hogwarts. Weasley's got no brains, Longbottom's a disaster, and Potter, he eyed Harry, smirking. Well, I suppose being raised by a family of blood traitors does have its effects. Something inside Harry flared with anger. He had never really thought about what people thought of him as a Weasley. To him, they were just his family. But Malfoy said it like it was an insult. Before Harry could say anything, George suddenly appeared beside them. Malfoy, don't you have something better to do? He said lazily. Like getting hexed by Peeves again? Malfoy glared. You'll regret that, Weasley. Sure, Fred said, appearing on Harry's other side. Run along now. Go practice being a disappointment to your father. Malfoy turned red and stormed off, Crabbe and Goyle trailing behind him. Harry let out a breath. Thanks, he muttered to the twins. Fred shrugged. That's what we're here for, little bro. George ruffled Harry's hair. Yeah, no one messes with a Weasley and gets away with it. Harry smiled. He might not have been born into the Weasley family, but at that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He was a Weasley, and that meant he was never alone. The first week at Hogwarts flew by in a blur of spells, essays, and late-night studying. Harry found himself struggling to keep up with the workload, but at least he wasn't alone. Ron was right there with him, groaning about homework and nearly setting his textbook on fire in Charms class. Hermione, of course, had already memorized half their coursework. One evening, as they sat in the common room finishing their astronomy charts, Fred and George strolled over, looking far too pleased with themselves. How would you lot like to witness some real magic? Fred whispered, glancing around mischievously. Ron groaned. If this is about one of your pranks, I'm too tired to deal with it. George feigned offense. Pranks? Us? Never. Come on, Fred insisted, nudging Harry. It'll be fun. Harry hesitated. He wasn't sure what they were planning, but life with the twins had already taught him that it was never boring. Where are we going? You'll see, George said with a wink. Curiosity won out. Harry and Ron abandoned their homework and followed the twins through the portrait hole. Hermione sighed dramatically but trailed after them, muttering about rule-breaking. The twins led them through the dimly lit corridors, moving with surprising ease for people who were sneaking around. They took turns ducking behind statues, slipping into alcoves, and stopping to listen for Filch. Finally, they reached their destination, a particular stretch of third-floor hallway. The twins turned to them with matching grins. Welcome, dear brothers and friends, to the entrance of the legendary secret passageway to the kitchens, Fred announced. Ron's eyes widened. Wait, you mean where the food comes from? The very same, George said. And the best part, the house elves down there are more than happy to whip up snacks for students who know how to ask nicely. Harry grinned. That sounds brilliant. Hermione frowned. Wait, house elves? You mean actual magical creatures working down there? Yeah, Ron said, shrugging. That's how Hogwarts runs. Hermione looked troubled, but before she could protest, Fred tapped a seemingly ordinary section of the stone wall with his wand. Tickle the pear, he instructed. Harry blinked. The what? George pointed to a painting of a fruit bowl hanging on the wall. See the pear? Give it a little tickle. Harry hesitated, then reached out and brushed his fingers over the painted pear. To his astonishment, it wiggled, then let out a tiny giggle before transforming into a green door handle. Fred pushed the door open with a flourish. After you. They stepped inside, and at once they were hit with a wave of warm, delicious-smelling air. The kitchen was massive, mirroring the great hall above. Hundreds of tiny house elves bustled about, stirring soups, baking bread, and carrying trays of food. One of them, a small elf with enormous ears and wide, round eyes, scurried up to them. Students, the elf squeaked excitedly. Come for extra treats, have you? If you don't mind, Dobby, George said with a grin. Dobby is always happy to help, the elf chirped. As they settled onto a bench, the elves quickly placed plates of pastries and mugs of hot cocoa in front of them. Harry couldn't believe it. He had never had this much food so easily before. "This is amazing," he said, taking a bite of a warm, flaky tart. Hermione, however, still looked troubled. "I don't know, it doesn't seem right, them serving us like this. They don't get paid, do they?" Fred shrugged. "House elves love their work. They take pride in it." Hermione didn't seem convinced, but before she could argue, the door to the kitchen slammed open. "What are you lot doing here?" "Filch." The caretaker's beady eyes darted from the pastries to the guilty-looking group. His face twisted into a delighted sneer. "Out of bed after hours, sneaking into the kitchen, stealing food. Oh, you're in for it now." Panic shot through Harry's chest. "Run!" The group scattered, dodging past the elves as Filch lunged at them. "Come back here." They raced through the door and down the corridor, feet pounding against the cold stone. The twins led the way, darting through shortcuts Harry hadn't even noticed before. "This way!" Fred hissed, pulling them behind a suit of armor just as Filch's footsteps thundered past. Silence. They held their breath, waiting. Finally, the footsteps faded. "That," Ron gasped, "was too close." Fred and George exchanged grins. "Close calls are part of the fun." "You call that fun?" Hermione snapped, looking furious. "We could have been expelled, but we weren't," George pointed out cheerfully. Ron, still panting, leaned against the wall. "I swear, you two are going to be the death of us." Harry, however, couldn't stop laughing. His heart was still racing, but for the first time in his life, sneaking around had been fun. There was no fear of punishment looming over him. No uncle or aunt ready to lock him in a cupboard. Just him and his friends, living life on their own terms. And that, Harry thought, was exactly how it should be. The next morning, Harry and Ron were still recovering from their late-night adventure in the kitchens. They had barely made it back to their dormitory without getting caught, and now they sat in the great hall, struggling to keep their eyes open over their breakfast plates. "You look like you barely slept," Hermione remarked, not even bothering to hide her disapproval. "That's because we didn't," Ron mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "And it's your fault for dragging us to the library right after breakfast." Hermione huffed. "Oh, I'm so sorry for trying to make sure you actually pass your classes." Before Ron could retort, a group of owls swooped into the great hall, delivering the morning post. A familiar blur of brown feathers dropped a letter in front of Ron before landing clumsily on the table. "Hermes," Ron said, surprised. "Mum hardly ever writes during term." Harry watched as Ron hesitantly opened the letter, his eyes scanning the parchment. As he read, his ears turned red. Never a good sign. "What is it?" Harry asked. Ron groaned, shoving the letter toward him. "See for yourself." Harry took it and read aloud. "Ronald Weasley, I received word that you and your brothers were caught sneaking around the castle at night. I cannot believe you would risk losing house points so carelessly. You and Harry had better be focusing on your studies, not running about after dark. Honestly, I expected this from Fred and George, but not from you. I will be having words with them as well." "Right back immediately, young man." Harry winced. "She really knows everything, doesn't she?" "Yeah," Ron grumbled. "It's like she's got spies in the castle." Fred, who had been eavesdropping, leaned in with a grin. "Mum's got a gift, I swear. Maybe she is part seer. Or maybe you lot are just really bad at being sneaky," Hermione said, shaking her head. Despite Mrs. Weasley's scolding, nothing else came of their late-night mischief, and soon, the usual rhythm of classes took over. Harry found himself growing more comfortable at Hogwarts with each passing day. One afternoon, during a break between lessons, he and Ron wandered outside toward the Quidditch pitch. "You ever think about trying out for the team?" Ron asked as they watched a few older students tossing a quaffle back and forth. Harry shrugged. "I dunno. I love flying, but I don't know if I'd be any good in an actual match." "You're brilliant at flying," Ron said. "You were the first one in our year to get on a broom, remember?" Harry smiled at the memory of his first flying lesson, but before he could reply, a loud whoosh of air made them both turn. A group of Slytherin students had arrived, their green robes billowing as they carried their broomsticks. At the front was Draco Malfoy, his smug expression making Harry immediately tense up. "Well, well, well," Malfoy drawled, spotting them. "Look who's hanging around the Quidditch pitch." Thinking about trying out, Weasley? They don't take charity cases, you know. Ron's face turned red. Shove off, Malfoy. Malfoy smirked, his eyes flicking toward Harry. And what about you, Potter? Trying to prove you belong here? Must be difficult, growing up in a family that isn't yours. Harry's grip tightened into fists. He had heard plenty of insults from Malfoy, but this one hit differently. Don't talk about them, he said coolly. Why not? Afraid someone will remind you that you're not really a Weasley. Malfoy sneered. You can borrow their robes, eat at their table, even take their mother's lectures, but you'll never be one of them. Ron took a step forward, but before he could say anything, a new voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? They all turned. Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, was striding toward them, his arms crossed. No problem, Malfoy said smoothly, though his smirk hadn't faded. Just giving Potter some friendly advice. Wood didn't look convinced. Get lost, Malfoy. With a scoff, Malfoy turned back to his group. Come on, he said to his fellow Slytherins. Let's leave the Gryffindor wannabe to his daydreaming. Harry clenched his jaw as Malfoy walked away, laughing with his friends. You shouldn't listen to him, Wood said, turning to Harry. You belong at Hogwarts, Potter. And if you ask me, you'd make a damn good seeker. Harry blinked. A seeker? Wood nodded. Fast reflexes, natural instincts. I saw the way you handled that broom during flying lessons. We could use someone like you on the team. Harry exchanged a look with Ron, who looked equally stunned. You mean you want me to try out? Not just try out, Wood said. I want you on the team. Harry's heart pounded. He hadn't expected this. He loved flying, but actually playing Quidditch. Could he do it? Ron grinned. Harry, this is huge. First-year students never get on the team. Wood clapped Harry on the shoulder. Think about it, Potter. We could use your talent. As Wood walked away, Ron practically bounced on the spot. This is brilliant. Harry couldn't help but smile. Maybe Malfoy was right about one thing. He wasn't born a Weasley. But that didn't mean he wasn't part of their family. And maybe, just maybe, he was about to carve out a place of his own at Hogwarts too. Harry spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely able to focus on his lessons. He couldn't believe it. He had just been offered a spot on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. First years weren't even allowed to try out. Yet somehow, Oliver Wood wanted him as seeker. At dinner, Fred and George were thrilled. Our little brother's best mate is going to be the youngest seeker in a century, Fred announced, clapping Harry on the back so hard he nearly dropped his pumpkin juice. We always knew you had it in you, mate, George added. McGonagall must really think you're something special if she's bending the rules for you. Harry flushed, feeling both excited and nervous. I haven't even played a real match yet. Don't worry about that, Fred said. We'll train you up. You'll be catching the snitch in your sleep, George added. Ron grinned. This is brilliant. You get to destroy Malfoy in Quidditch and prove you belong here all in one go. Hermione, however, didn't seem quite as thrilled. I still don't see how this is more important than studying. Ron groaned. Oh, come on, Hermione. This is Quidditch. You do know how big of a deal this is, right? Of course I do, Hermione said, folding her arms. But Harry should be focusing on his studies, not flying around dodging bludgers. Harry gave her a sheepish smile. I'll make sure to keep up with my schoolwork, I promise. Hermione didn't look convinced, but she didn't push the issue further. The next morning, Harry made his way to the Quidditch pitch for his first official training session. Wood was already there, holding a large wooden crate filled with Quidditch balls. Right, Potter, Wood said, tossing him a broomstick. This is a Nimbus 2000, best broom you can get. Courtesy of Professor McGonagall. Harry's eyes widened. She got me a Nimbus 2000? She wants Gryffindor to win the cup as badly as I do, Wood said with a grin. Now, let's see what you've got. Training was intense. Wood ran Harry through drill after drill, making him dive, swerve, and chase the tiny golden snitch across the field. By the time they finished, Harry's arms ached, but he had never felt so alive. You're a natural, Potter, Wood said, clearly pleased. Malfoy won't stand a chance. Harry couldn't wait for their first match. But as the days passed, he started to notice something strange. He often felt like someone was watching him, even when he was alone. At first, he thought it was just nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. One evening, as he walked back to the Gryffindor common room, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, nothing. Harry. He spun again, relieved to see Ron hurrying toward him. You all right? Ron asked. Yeah, Harry said slowly. Just thought I heard something. Ron frowned. Weird. Let's get back to the common room. But the uneasy feeling lingered. And as they stepped through the portrait hole, Harry couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, was watching him. The unsettling feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger with each passing day. Harry tried to brush it off as nerves. After all, his first Quidditch match was coming up, and he had a lot on his mind. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. It wasn't just paranoia. Something, or someone was watching him. One evening, after an exhausting day of lessons and Quidditch practice, Harry sat by the fire in the Gryffindor common room, staring into the flames. Ron was beside him, struggling to finish his transfiguration essay while occasionally sneaking bites of a chocolate frog. Hermione, of course, had finished all her work ages ago and was now reading Hogwarts, a history for what had to be the 10th time. You all right, mate? Ron asked through a mouthful of chocolate. Harry hesitated before answering. Do you ever feel like someone's watching you? Ron frowned. You mean like Filch? Because, yeah, all the time. Not Filch, Harry said quietly. Someone else. It's like I can feel it, even when I'm alone. Ron's expression turned serious. That's kind of creepy, actually. Harry, that's just your imagination, Hermione said, not even looking up from her book. You've been under a lot of stress with Quidditch and classes. Your mind is playing tricks on you. Harry wasn't convinced, but he didn't argue. If he couldn't explain it, how could he expect them to understand? That night, as he lay in bed, he tried to push the feeling aside. The dormitory was silent except for the soft snores of his roommates. He closed his eyes, telling himself he was just imagining things. Then he heard it. A soft creak. His eyes snapped open. The room was dark, only faintly illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. He held his breath, listening. Another creak. Someone was there. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he slowly reached for his wand under his pillow. He strained his eyes, trying to see past the darkness. And then, a shadow moved. Right by the door. Harry sat up quickly, his fingers tightening around his wand. Who's there? Silence. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then, the door clicked shut. Harry's stomach twisted. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the door, but when he flung it open, the hallway was empty. No footsteps. No sign of anyone. Just the cold, eerie silence of the castle at night. The next morning, Harry told Ron what had happened. Someone was in our dormitory? Ron asked, eyes wide. I think so, Harry said. I know I heard something. And I saw something move. Ron swallowed. That's not just creepy, that's terrifying. We should tell a professor, Hermione said at breakfast, her voice firm. Ron shook his head. And say what? That Harry thinks he saw something? What if it was just one of the older students sneaking around? But what if it wasn't? Harry said, lowering his voice. What if someone was actually in our room? Hermione still looked skeptical, but she didn't argue. As the days passed, nothing else happened. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but whoever, or whatever, had been in their dormitory didn't return. At least, not that Harry could tell. Still, he couldn't shake the unease in his gut. Something was wrong, and he had a feeling that sooner or later, he was going to find out exactly what.